Thank you very much. I want to welcome you now to the fourth Marcia Feld, Marcia Mocker Feld lecture series here at the University of Rhode Island's Providence campus. You will find, I believe, in your program a biography and history of Marcia's experience here, not only at the Providence campus, but also at the University of Rhode Island. I want to tell you that I have traveled to many institutions of higher education, and they always ask you the same question: where are you from? And I say, I'm from the University of Rhode Island. And the response inevitably is, oh, you know Marcia Feld. I say, yes, how do you know it? She was my teacher. It's amazing the number of lives that she has touched. In fact, quite frankly, I don't know if I told you, I was at Temple. Did I tell you that already? Oh, Temple University. I was talking to some faculty members there, and they said, oh, Marcia Feld. They forgot about me. But then, after all, I may not be that important. Then we want to start this program, and it's going to be an interesting one, as you will be able to tell. You see the flashes that are going on. That's coming from Anne Marie. Anne Marie is taking pictures, which will appear on our Facebook. Those of you who are computer active, you'll find that in there. Be very good to Anne Marie, because you never can tell what kind of picture she will put on you in the Facebook. But seriously, after a couple of days or so, it should appear there, the program and some of the activities that's going on. I would like to recognize some of the dignitaries that are in the audience. I can't see you because someone turned the lights out, but I'm assuming when I say the names that they are there. To start off with, and I'll introduce them later on, is our Provost, Donald DeHaze. Rabbi and Mrs. Eddie Feld. Keith Stokes, our new Director of Rhode Island Education Economic Development Corporation, and who will also be on the panel tonight. Richard Kerbel, who is a Director of Administration for the City of Providence, who is coming in representing the Mayor of Providence, Mayor David Cicilline. My colleague, Mr. Gary Bozelinski, who is the Chief Information Officer for the University of Rhode Island. Mr. Don Teller, who is the Director of Planning, City of Providence. I'm assuming all these people are here. We will introduce our speaker later on. But I don't know if Mr. Dennis Langley is here as well from the Urban League. Is he here? Okay, he's at a meeting beforehand, so he'll be here. And of course, I'd like to represent, and always a supporter of this campus, Representative Robert Jacquard. And his wife, Kathy. Okay, good for that. But without any delay, let me introduce the Provost of the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Donald DeHaze previously was one of the deans in the University of Vermont. He's been here now. He's been here 2 years already? 2 years. Now in Rhode Island, that doesn't count. Okay. You get 40 years, then maybe we'll start counting going over. But he's been here 2 years and has done an amazing job. He's a very strong supporter of the urban notion and a very strong supporter of community planning. Dr. DeHaze.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. In particular, I want to take a moment to welcome back to the University of Rhode Island Professor Feld. It's wonderful to have you here and for me to learn about the wonderful legacy that you've created for your students, but also for all the citizens, community members, partners. You developed a program here that will live on for a long time. Professor Landis, thank you for joining us from the University of Pennsylvania. We found out during dinner that was, what, some 20 or 30 years ago. He actually has some roots right here in Providence. Looks a little different now than last time he was here, but we're very pleased to have you back on our campus. Let me just say a few words briefly. As I think about kind of the future of Providence, Rhode Island, the nation, and even the world, it's interesting to think about the sort of intersection of the three themes that are integral to this lecture series, and I expect tonight's presentation as well. That is urban development, social justice, and planning. Frankly, in my view, if we don't figure out how to tie those three things together in the modern world today, I don't think we're going to figure out our future. It was just 2, maybe 3 years ago when I think 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. We passed that mark. I think it was 3 years ago. Actually, 3 years ago in April. And if I have my numbers correct, somewhere about 80% of the U.S. population lives in what's defined as urban areas. When we talk about issues of equity, justice, fairness, economic opportunity, if we don't figure a way to build that connection around social justice, we're going to spin our wheels for a few wealthy people and leave many others behind. And finally, the issue of planning. In my former job, dean of an environmental school, we had an environmental planning program, the largest enrollment graduate program in the college I was dean of. And that's clearly going to be a big part of our future. Not uncommon, universities, organizations, businesses are all wrapped up in their version of planning their future, strategically investing the limited resources that they have to achieve the goals that are essential to create vital communities. That, ladies and gentlemen, I think is a big part of our future. And this series, named in honor of Dr. Feld, highlights that opportunity before us. Thank you all for being here and for being part of the University of Rhode Island tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. One of the great supporters of the Providence campus has been the mayor of the city of Providence. As some of you may know, we recently in this building signed a memorandum of understanding and cooperation with the University of Santo Domingo, located in Dominican Republic. University of Santo Domingo is the oldest public institution in the New World, having been founded by Christopher Columbus. At the time it was named, I think, St. Thomas Aquinas. My colleague, Mr. Bozelinski, and I traveled there right after the earthquake in Haiti. In fact, we had students in Santo Domingo during that earthquake, and they took very good care of them. So we developed a very good relationship with that. But it was the mayor of the city of Providence who provided us with some of the financial and personnel support we needed to go there and put together those programs. So it is very fitting here that Mr. Richard Cabell come and give us some greetings from the city.
First of all, I want to express the mayor's sorrow that he couldn't be here tonight. He had another engagement, but there are a couple of things that I know he would have said if he was here. First of all, he would have said, when you listen to this lecture, think about the knowledge economy and the knowledge district and what is happening in the former jewelry district. Secondly, he would say, take some time to look at the city's webpage, look at some information on RIPTA's webpage and some information that Kevin Flynn probably has on his webpage about Transit 2020 and the importance of transit in sustainable development. Third, he probably would have said to look on the city's webpage and read Greenprint, which is the mayor's plan for sustainable development in the city. And finally, he would have said, if you have a chance and you know somebody who's looking, look in Sunday's Projo, and there's an ad for the energy sustainability manager for the city of Providence. And if you know any good applicants, we would like you to encourage them to apply. So we always have to get the free ads in that way to get some good employees for the city. Sustainable development is very important to the future of our city, important to the future of our state. We are anxious to hear the lecture, and thank you all for coming to it.
We thank Richard and the mayor for those words. For over 30 years, Dr. Masha Mocker Feld devoted herself to her students and to furthering social justice, especially in Rhode Island cities. These annual lectures honor and commemorate Dr. Feld's contribution by bringing the very best thinkers to the University of Rhode Island in a forum where we can both enlighten students and faculty and share their ideas with a wider community. A pioneer who paved the way for women in planning, a visionary who recognized the potential of university-community partnerships, a tireless advocate for this country's urban areas and the people who live there, and a beloved teacher. Masha Mocker Feld has never made major contributions to the University of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, or has made. Did I say never made? Oh, sorry. Go back. Has made major contributions to the University of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, urban America, and the planning professions. It is very important, I think, that the University of Rhode Island, and particularly the Providence campus, does not fail to recognize her ability. I pointed out about 4 or 5 years ago to Marshall Feldman and others who were there that we had another woman of great visionary that went through the university, actually became equally as great. And people we didn't even recognize that she was here. Her name was Margaret Mead. And if some of you knew about sociology and anthropology, you would remember that she is one of the major names there. The major name here in community planning is Masha Mocker Feld, whom I introduce you to now.
John, I'm going to introduce you from sitting down, okay? Okay, thank you, John McCrae, for your generous introduction and for your support in maintaining and expanding the mission of CCE and the Urban Initiative College in the URI system. And thank you, new Provost. It's very promising, the kind of words that you said, and I appreciate it, and so do the city planners in this room. Thank you. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to especially thank John McCrae's Secret Weapons. First, our newly appointed Associate Dean, Kat Quinner. Kat, will you stand? Thank you, Kat, for everything you do for planning and for us. And then CCE's director, Joanne DeVello, and her team. Joanne, will you stand? Thank you. And a heartfelt thank you to the brand new CPAD Alumni and Friend Council. And can I ask them to stand? Their names are in the program. Please stand. I know you're here. And lastly, and with great pride, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our state senior practitioner, Glenn Kumakawa. Glenn? And senior academic in planning, Howard Foster Jr. Howard? Thank you. As for John Landis, who I said I would introduce, in January 1983, I walked into a CPAD classroom for the spring semester in methods for the first-year students. Are there any members of the class of 83, 84, 85? Just honk or something. Great, I see one back there, and I hope there are more. There, seated at my desk, was a graduate student reading the textbook. I sort of stopped in surprise and said, "Can I help you?" "Probably," he said, "but I know I can help you. My name is John Landis, and I am teaching the technical side of methods with you." And indeed, John was more than a help. He introduced methods to CPAD and to Rhode Island planning in the technical methods that spring and that fall. And then a little over a year later, he left, was gone to the South and the West, and wound up at UC Berkeley, eventually chair of the department. After several years there, John moved on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he is currently Crossways Professor of City and Regional Planning and chair of the department. During this time in California, John developed the California Future System of urban development and growth models, and became an international expert in sustainable urban development. He's currently completing a study for the National Science Foundation, developing alternative spatial scenarios of US population and employment patterns through 2050. Through his writings, he then traces the impact of the scenarios on the social policy issues of housing. John gives his students and readers a sense of his dual commitment, the technical commitment and then the social policy commitment, making it both norms in our field. Friends and guests, please welcome John Landis, PhD, AICP, an outstanding asset of our field.
Thank you very much, Marcia, and thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to be back here in Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm especially thrilled to be able to talk to you as part of the Masha Mocker Feld lecture series. I don't remember the story Marcia told in exactly the same way that she told it, no surprise there, but I do remember Marcia Feld very vividly. When I arrived at the University of Rhode Island in 1983, I think Marcia sort of took me on as sort of a special project and took me on as a challenge to sort of convince that all the numbers and all the systems and all the computers, while useful, weren't what the heart of city and regional planning was about, and that she would teach me that. She never said it in quite so many words. She was far too gracious to do that. So between my first and second years in CPAD, Marcia said, you don't have to commute all the way. We lived in the east side of Providence, my wife and I, and Marcia said, you don't have to commute all that way down to Kingston. Why don't you come and hang out in the summer in something called the Field Center, Urban Field Center, I think it was. It was a building that I guess they knocked down so you could relocate a river or something like that. And it was really a wonderful summer. I remember Mary Perella was there. Yeah, there wasn't a computer in sight. There wasn't a printout. There was just lots of papers on Marcia's desk and lots of papers on everyone else's desk. I think that's Marcia's signature there. And over the course of the summer, I indeed learned how to be a city planner. Marcia didn't sit in front of a computer running models. Marcia sat on the telephone and talked and talked and talked to people and raised money to help people, to help students, to help her students, to help students in public schools, to help local planners. Marcia's idea of city planning was to help people one person at a time, and if you did enough of it, it added up and it made a difference. And I think the people here and the people of Rhode Island have really benefited tremendously. I know I did, and it was the completing part of my education. So thank you very much, Marcia. So let's see if we can get there we are. Now let's see if I've learned anything about this technology here. Okay. I don't know if anybody in the audience is old enough to remember what used to be called a twofer. It was like a doubleheader, a baseball game, or a double feature. I don't think they still have double headers. They don't have double features anymore. And once upon a time, when you went to the theater in New York or somewhere else, if you did it judiciously, you could get a twofer, which is you could get 2 tickets for the price of 1. And that's what I'm going to try and do this evening. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about a presentation I've given on planning successes, examples of planning success stories at the local level, and we'll try and figure out what makes planning success stories. It turns out there aren't that many of them around, so I'm feel very fortunate to be able to talk about 12 of them, and then move on and take some of those lessons and talk about what some of those lessons mean perhaps for the future of Rhode Island. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why we should study success. As I said, we don't do enough of it. I want to present my 12 planning successes, and what usually happens is people have lots more ideas about successes, and I'd like to hear your ideas. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing Rhode Island and what some of the prospects look like, and then close with some ideas for a sustainable development agenda for Rhode Island. Now, I have to admit that other than occasionally looking in the USA Today, I haven't been following everything that's happened in Rhode Island for the last 25 years, so I'm sure I will occasionally have some inaccuracies, and I'm sure people here will fill me in on all that's happening, and hopefully can make my presentation and my ideas a little more accurate. I want to start by talking about successes, and the idea for this came about a year and a half ago when at Penn, when a fellow named Witold Rybczynski, who is the editor of, he's an urban historian, and he's also the editor of the Wharton Business Review, and he's also the author of a wonderful book on cities called City Life. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's simply terrific. He's a great writer, and he was publishing an article by a fellow named Randall O'Toole, who's a libertarian, in the Wharton Business Review, and called Why Plans Fail. And this article talked about all the things that planners do to make the world a worse place. And that's all they do. And Witold asked me, in the sort of spirit of fair play, would I be willing to write a rejoinder article on successful planning? And I said, sure, thinking that it would be easy to come up with lots of examples and easy to refute this guy, Randall O'Toole. And it actually did turn out to be not that difficult. And so for the next year and a half, or about a year, I would go around asking everybody I knew to give me some examples of successful planning interventions. And I got a list of about 25, and I'm going to share 12 of them tonight. And I think it is very important to talk about planning successes. It is important in part because planners are very good at being self-critical and talking about their failures. I mentioned this guy, Randall O'Toole. He subsequently published a book called The Best Laid Plans, in which he complained that planners always get it wrong. They always misallocate resources compared to what the market would do. And in particular, they always favor higher densities, whereas the average person likes a single-family house. And in particular, they always favor the use of public transit, whereas the average person likes a car, so planners always get it wrong. Not a very sophisticated analysis, but one you can say very, very quickly. But within the planning field, a geographer, Sir Peter Hall from England, and some of you perhaps have read, he's published a lot and read some of his books, they're wonderful, put out a very important book in 1982 called Great Planning Disasters. And his argument, and he focused on a number of big disasters, the expansion of Heathrow, the adoption of an interstate highway ring around London, the Concord SST, the Sydney Opera House, among others. And what Peter Hall was, he wasn't chiding planners for producing failures, but he was telling a cautionary tale of the dangers of what happens to cities and to planning when there's an over-fascination with technology, when there's a belief in super large mega projects, when there's the belief that planners and planning type interventions can massively reshape cities into better places, when there's a faith in, too much faith in regulation and not enough faith in entrepreneurship, and most of all, when there's a skepticism of the power of markets, competition, and incentives. And what Peter was saying is that planners tend to suffer from these grandiose infrastructure visions without thinking about how they actually affect people's lives. And Peter was writing a cautionary tale to stop doing that and to, again, start perhaps thinking a little bit more about planning the way Marcia Feld thinks about it. So I undertook this task of trying to identify successes in part as a way to, as a rejoinder to Randall O'Toole, but as a way of following up to find out if we've learned anything since Peter Hall wrote his book in 1982. Now, I said before that planning as a field doesn't really spend a lot of time. It likes to focus on its failures, and it really doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on what it's done well and its successes. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that planning is almost by definition a very long-term agenda, very long-term undertaking, and by the time plans come true and are implemented, people have moved on to different concerns and different ideas. They forgot why they did the plan. The necessity of the plan is often forgotten, and people are impatient and they want to go on to the next big thing, and planners tend to be a little more patient, and there's a little bit of conflict in there. Also, planners tend to regard the effort in the process often as more important than the outcome. So we went through a good process, we involved citizens, we came up with good ideas, and so what if it didn't work out? At least the process was a good one. Planning suffers from a lack of predictive theories and a lack of predictive models. So if you want to find out whether your plans worked, you first have to sort of come up with a prediction of how the world will look if you don't plan, so that when you do plan, you can contrast the two. We call that the baseline. Planners don't do that very well, so they don't know what the world would look like in the absence of their plans, so they can't evaluate their plans. As an educator, I can tell you we don't spend enough time in our planning schools and other schools as well, talking about the importance of evaluation, talking about coming back and seeing whether it worked. And frankly, anybody who's ever done a program knows that the first dollar to go is always the dollar for the evaluation study. So this is a field that doesn't spend enough time looking at what it does well. And as a result of that, the whole field of success often gets defined by others, non-planners, some of whom are quite hostile to the idea of planning and to planning successes. In the 1960s, this hostility or this critique emerged, centered around two issues, centered around the public interest and centered around a critique of cost-benefit or benefit-cost analysis. In the 1960s, a bunch of people started seeing planning, and not incorrectly so, often as the handmaiden of established political and business interests. Planning said it wanted to change the world, but too often ended up being captured by the people in power and the corporations, and so it never changed the world. That was one critique. And the other was that when planners tried to, or when anybody tried to evaluate things, they used something called benefit-cost analysis, and that just focused on the dollar things that you could measure. It didn't focus on social equity. It didn't focus on distributional impacts. It didn't focus on the things that were difficult to measure. It was way too narrow. And so you couldn't judge planning success because either planning was captured by big interests or it posed itself so narrowly that it couldn't measure things properly. And then in the late 1960s, the neoconservative school came up, and I've mentioned some names here, Martin Anderson, Irving Kristol, and Nathan Glazer, and their argument was that planners as a group are so optimistic and so aspirational and so under-scientific that they always overreach and always underanalyze rational responses. That is, if you change things, then people are going to react sometimes favorably, sometimes unfavorably, and that planners tend not to think how people will rationally respond to the types of regulations and incentives that are put there, and that we need to be more systematic in how we thought. In the 1980s, of course, there was the Reagan Revolution, which said that planning is part of government, and government is really not the solution. It's really part of the problem, and that the way to think about moving forward is to have less government and, by extension, less planning. And even today, we still suffer from some of this. Oh gosh, okay, looks like I'm getting a little bit of a signal here. Okay, there we go. And even today, in the era of sustainability, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, there's a great tendency to focus not on robust evaluations, but on what we call best practices, things that seemed to work somewhere. It was a good idea over there, let's try it over here. That's not wrong, but that's not the same thing as a robust evaluation. Thankfully, the Obama administration seems to be departing from that, and if you look at what's happening in the Obama administration, there's really an emphasis on what they're calling, a welcome emphasis on what they're calling evidence-based policy, at least so far, and I have high hopes for that. So, let's see, moving right along, or not. Okay. How do we get to the next slide here? I'm trying to. Okay, thank you. So, here's the hard question. How do we determine whether a plan is a success or not? And among planners, sometimes we set the bar very low and we say, well, if the plan didn't sit on the shelf, if somebody read it, other than the planner's mother, it was a success. Any plan that is implemented and doesn't sit on the shelf is a success, and I think obviously that's really is setting the bar too low. Another sort of definition of success is a plan or program that achieves its goals and objectives. It actually works. It changed things in accord with its goals and objectives, and that's actually a good start, but then one has to ask the question, well, how much did it cost, and what changed, and did everybody benefit, and those sorts of things. So the idea that, well, it achieved its goals and objectives, that's a good starting point, but it's not the ending point. And so if we expand it a little bit and say a plan or program or project that generates quantifiable benefits in excess of costs, so the winners outnumber the losers, the overall pie increases as a result, maybe that's success. And I think that's not a bad definition, but again, it's incomplete because, of course, not everything can be fully monetized and discounted and summed in a number. So here's my definition of success, and I hope to be a little provocative. It's a local and public initiative focusing on the built or natural environment which results in a net private and social benefit and which can serve as a model for similar efforts. That's a mouthful, and so let me see if I can parse this a little bit. First of all, I'm going to focus tonight on local and public initiatives. So I'm going to focus on things that are undertaken at the local level where they're real and they impact people's lives. I'm not going to talk about national policy initiatives or programs. I'm going to focus on local initiatives. Secondly, I'm going to focus on initiatives that happen in the public sector. This isn't to say that good planning efforts don't happen in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector, but I'm going to focus on the public sector. Third, I'm going to focus on projects that have impacts in the built or natural environment. And by the built environment, I'm including the people who live in the built environment, so I'm looking for social success as well. So I'm looking for projects or programs that has a physical or place-based dimension to them, or an environmental dimension, or a social dimension. And lastly, very importantly, you got to be able to say, well, this worked over here. Could it be a model for other efforts somewhere else? So let me tell you about my 12 planning successes. If any of you actually read the article in the Wharton Business Review, the editors did not agree with my 12. They cut it down to 10. And I'll let you guess which 2 they omitted. These are all post-1973 successes. Why 1973? 1973 is the end of the era of federal urban programs and projects. It's essentially the end of the finishing of the interstate highway system. It's the end of our old approach to urban renewal and public housing. It was the beginning of the community development block grant. It's the transition of planning from a federal activity to primarily a local activity. So I'm going to start at that point. So here are my 12. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of them. There are many others, but they are the California Coastal Act and Commission, the Chesapeake Bay Program, the Planning Zoning Consistency Laws, the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, Portland's Urban Growth Boundaries, New York City's Public-Private Partnerships, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program, the new Urbanist Communities, downtown ballparks, local land trusts, and finally Chicago's Millennium Park. I could have added urban waterfronts, festival marketplaces, anti-pollution laws, Hope 6, inclusionary zoning ordinances, and thousands of local comprehensive plans. And in fact, I'm going to come back to them when I talk about Rhode Island. I hope I piqued your interest, and I hope that maybe you disagree with some of this. The ones that my students are the most suspicious of is downtown ballparks, perhaps. Let me start with, I think, the greatest environmental success story in the United States of the last 40 years, and that's the California Coastal Act and Coastal Commission. And let me just put it, it started, and I'm going to review these in chronological order. About 30 million people live within 90 miles of the coast of California. It's an amazing number, and yet, and that number is up about 10 million. So we go back to about 1975, there were about 20 million people. Today it's about 30 million people. Another 10 million people live within 50 million miles of the coast of California, and yet, for most purposes, the coast is largely unchanged. 10 million people and there's virtually no physical change to the coast of California. That's an amazing conservation success story, repeated no other place in the United States. If you look at similar levels of population growth in North Carolina or Texas or Florida, the coasts of those areas have been entirely overwhelmed with development. California has preserved its coast. How did they do that? Actually, this wasn't a city planner initiative. This was a voter initiative in 1972. It set up the California Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission regulates development and ensures access. That's its primary purpose, assuring public access to the coastal zone. It also coordinates the coastal aspects of local comprehensive plans. It's succeeded tremendously. You can walk anywhere along the coast in California. And what are the reasons for that? Well, a few reasons for that. Again, success breeds success when it comes to conservation. There's a good cop, bad cop argument where the bad cop, the people who say that you can't develop your coastal property, is the state coastal commission, but they don't have to be the bad cop very often. So the good cop can be the city or the county that says, we're not stopping you from developing, the coastal commission is, so the coastal commission is the bad cop, but they don't do that very often. More importantly, they've worked with local government to build local environmental protection capacity, and very important, they've been, protecting the coast has been very consistent with California's self-image as an environmental leader. This issue of issue framing, of doing the right thing as consistent with your image of yourself, is very important, and I'm going to come back to that. A related success story, the Chesapeake Bay Program, started in 1983. It's an interstate partnership. It involves 3 states, more than a dozen federal agencies, and many state and local institutions in a science-based effort to improve the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem by reducing pollution and runoff, by promoting restoration, and very importantly, by limiting development. Until last year, this was widely regarded as a success, and when I wrote this article, it was regarded as a success. I'll tell you something that happened after that. It was regarded as a success because the surveys found that pollution levels in the Chesapeake Bay were declining, and the ecosystem seemed to be improving since 1983. Why was this a success in the sense? Well, it had these metrics of pollution levels and ecosystem. It was science-based. It was a collaborative process between agencies, between states, between parts of science. It worked through the existing political system. There was no new big agency that had regulatory effort. It worked through existing political entities. There was a shared gain, improved ecology, and shared pain. Everybody, it wasn't just the developers who got short shrift, it was the farmers who had to regulate their activities. But very importantly, it tried to respect existing property rights. It limited development. It didn't stop development. Now, the reason I have a caveat here is that about a year ago, we found out that they cooked the books. The story of the Chesapeake Bay is a very interesting one. The bay has not gotten worse, but it has not gotten better. And the progress that is being taken in terms of reducing pollution and restoring the ecosystem seems to be taking a little longer. It had been presented, all the numbers that had been presented by the EPA seemed to suggest it was getting better. In fact, it has not gotten better, but it hasn't gotten worse. So maybe this one shouldn't be in there. Number 3, planning zoning consistency requirements. About a dozen states in the U.S. require that if you have a zoning ordinance, if you went to planning school, you learned that you had the plan and that zoning was the implementation tool of the plan, that zoning followed on planning. And yet, only about a dozen states actually require that in the form of what's called a consistency requirement, where the zoning has to correspond to the plan. In about 40 states, the zoning ordinances are very, very different than the plans, and they don't correspond at all. In about 10 states, anytime you change the zoning ordinance, you have to change the plan, and anytime you change the plan, you have to change the zoning ordinance. We call that a consistency requirement. It sharply reduces ad hoc development. It means that the development that occurs may not be the best development, but at least people have thought about what they want to have happen. It requires individual development decisions to adhere to a larger framework. It deters ad hoc decisions and developments. It links conditions of approval to the broader public purpose. It means that anytime there's a condition of approval of a plan, it has to be linked back to what we want to have happen. And lastly, it promotes consistency and certainty. If you compare the 2 states, the 2 fast-growing states that, one, California, that has zoning planning consistency, and Texas, which doesn't, there's a huge difference in the planning process, and there's a huge difference in that there's a huge disconnect in Texas between what the plan says and what happens. and there's a pretty good connect in California. The 10 states that do this, they've really reduced, they've really made the idea of cumulative impact assessment mean something. I'm going to go quickly over a few of these. The original Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, 1976. Many of you, maybe some of you in this room remember, Marcia, I don't know if you do, once upon a time, if you wanted to go from Boston to New York, it took you about 6 hours, okay? Today it takes about 3 hours. If you want to go from New York to Washington, D.C., you can get there on the regional service in about 2 hours and 45 minutes. Compared to 30 years ago, that cuts the travel times about 50%. This was the result of something called the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project. I struggle when I show you the amounts of money that were spent on this. $2.6 billion in 1976. Another $2.5 billion. So we spent only about $5 billion. $5 billion today is the cost of what, a Mercedes-Benz or something, and yet they built a whole upgraded the system tremendously. This has been quite a success, and I will tell you that if you ever drive on 95 or drive on the New Jersey Turnpike through New Jersey or through Maryland, they've widened that road over the last 30 years, but there's been a threefold increase in the amount of traffic on 95 from Boston to Washington. Threefold increase in the amount of, a threefold increase in the amount of volume of trips, non-air trips going from Boston to New York to Washington in 30 years, and very small capacity increases on the road. A lot of that increase has gone into the rail system. It's been very successful. Why? Because it resulted in real travel time improvements. It wasn't a science fiction system. It was a real improvements to an existing system. It was an improvements to an existing system that had to compete with air travel, so you have that competitive imperative to do well. There have been some drawbacks. Originally, they were supposed to be a keystone for urban development improvements around the station areas. That did happen in Providence. It didn't happen in a lot of other areas. Here's a controversial one, Portland's urban growth boundary. Very, very controversial to hear people talk about it. It was established in 1979. It covers 350 square miles in 24 municipalities in 3 counties. It's an urban growth boundary around what here would be basically the area of Rhode Island. It's administered by a regional agency called Portland Metro. It gets a lot of flack. Its principal purpose is to rationalize the conversion of farmland to subdivisions, to stop willy-nilly sprawl from consuming agricultural land. It has to be renewed every 5 years and enlarged as needed. In 1998, it was enlarged by 10%. It's been very successful. Farmland in the Portland area has been dramatically preserved. If you look at the increase in population and the loss of farmland, for every new person in the Portland metropolitan area, Portland has lost about 0.2 acres. So every new person added to the Portland metropolitan area has consumed about 0.2 acres of farmland. The next 0.2, that's 1/5 of an acre. The next best performance in the United States is the San Francisco Bay Area, which is about 0.4 acres per every new person. So it's really protected a lot of farmland very successfully. Why does it do that? It's easy to understand. The map is easy to understand. There's a clear link between the purpose and the policy that is protecting farmland. They have a regional government that is firm but also very flexible. They've coupled it with infill incentives, and they've tried to do very little social engineering along the way. It's basically been a resource protection. This is one that's a little closer to home. Public-private partnerships, 2 in New York, Times Square, starting in 1977, and Battery Park City in 1980. I'm sure many of, when I give this presentation, other places, some people haven't been to Times Square or perhaps Battery Park City. Times Square is the preeminent tourist destination in in New York City. It wasn't always the case, but it is now. And Battery Park City, we talk about new urbanist communities. Battery Park City and the southern tip of Manhattan is the largest, densest, and most urban new community anywhere in the U.S. It includes offices, residential, and neighborhood commercial, and public uses. It's what we think of as a mixed-use progressive community at the tip of Manhattan. It's a great place. Both of these places were public-private partnerships developed with planners and private developers. Very sophisticated public-private partnerships by people who knew their business. They had multiple false starts. It took 3 times to get both of these right. It required rejiggering the program. It required rejiggering the financing, but the people had the patience to get it right. It was built on public-private professionalism. It was built on planners understanding how developers work and developers understanding what planners needed. The low-income housing tax credit. Here's where I'm going to violate my statement not to look at federal programs simply because this has been so very successful. More than 2 million affordable housing units built since 1986 in 25 years. That's an incredible production record. No other program in the United States comes close. By the way, these are truly affordable. These are affordable to people who make 50% of area or less of area median income. It allows affordable housing developers, who are chiefly nonprofits, to sell tax credits to companies and investors in exchange for upfront cash, which generally covers about half the development cost. It funds rental housing construction, affordable, I mentioned 50% or less of your median income. In Philadelphia, I don't know about Providence, but in Philadelphia, it builds housing for people who make less than $35,000 a year if you're a family of four. A lot of reasons it's been so successful. It works through the tax code. It doesn't require a big bureaucracy. The housing that's built is nicer than your house. It rewards quality. The competitiveness, the competition part of it rewards high quality development. You still find some people opposed to it, some NIMBYs coming out, but after the projects are built, they all say, wow, that turned out pretty well. The program's transparent if you understand it, but it's not easy to do. And it really requires a level of sophistication. And lastly, it's been very successful at leveraging other funds. Related to that, the historic preservation tax credits, which is this idea of giving similar types of tax credits if you do historic preservation. You can see some of the details here. I'll just say that it's been used to rehabilitate since 1976 more than 35,000 properties, generating $45 to $50 billion of new investment in cities. Here are a few pictures of them. Again, some of the same reasons for success as the low-income housing tax credit. Transparent, but not easy. That ends up being important. Here's one that's a little controversial, the new urbanist communities. Promoting walkability and reducing car use through a grid-like street pattern and a mix of housing and land use types. Using design themes to define walkable neighborhoods, create a recognizable community center for commerce and social interaction, and limit sprawl at the city's edge. Worldwide, there have been about 100 new urbanist communities built, mostly in the US and Australia. I call these a success. The reasons for that, they lead the market, but they don't ignore the market. They have very good street patterns and very good site plans. Whatever you think about sort of the new urbanism as being elitism and being shishi architecture, if you actually go to these communities, you'd want to live there. They do density gracefully. And lastly, over time, the property values in these communities increase faster than in non-new urbanist communities. It takes a while for these to gain traction, but most of them have turned out very well. Here's the interesting one, downtown ballparks. I expect this to be very controversial depending on whether you're a Yankees or Red Sox fan. About 16 of them have been done, 2 in 2009, Yankee Stadium and City Park in New York. They're sometimes called retro parks. They're designed exclusively for baseball, less seating, smaller footprints, less parking. They make the downtown urban experience, sports experience very important. They allowed some of these ballparks to be integrated into neighborhoods. They haven't all been a success, but I will say since 1960s, urban planners have been searching for the magic programmatic bullet to catalyze downtown revival that seems to work everywhere. We tried festival marketplaces. They worked for about 10 years. We tried some other things. These things seem to work. The 3 preeminent examples, Coors Field in Denver, AT&T Park in San Francisco, and the unfortunately named Petco Field in San Diego. In all of these places, they have catalyzed huge amounts of development that have brought huge numbers of people to, not just to ball games, but to live back into the cities and to create whole new waves of urban development. And it's not just the West Coast, it's places like Cleveland, it's places like Pittsburgh. I'm not saying these are good for the city's bottom line in terms of fiscally. They often, in terms of municipal fiscal impact, they often end up costing the city a lot, but as urban development catalysts, they've been surprisingly successful. Local land trusts using private nonprofits to protect undeveloped land. Since 2005, more than, I'm sorry, that should be since 1995, More than 1,650 local land trusts have protected 12 million acres in the United States. 12 million acres of land not developed since 1995. In that period, governments other than land trusts, all governments combined, have protected 1 million acres of this land. The private land trusts have protected 12 times that amount. They work by bottom-up common benefit planning. They end up being much more durable than alternatives, especially zoning. And if you do it right, funds can be set aside for management. And here's my favorite, Millennium Park. And here again, I'm going to deviate a little from my standards to define success. Have people here been to Millennium Park? Anybody been to Millennium Park? It's fabulous. Okay, it's the best urban park of the 20th century. If Central Park was the best urban park of the 19th century, Millennium Park is the best urban park of the 20th century, and that's not just me. That's everybody who's ever been there. It's just 24 and a half acres inside. It's built on top of a 19th century rail yard. It's programmed for the maximum urban green experience together. So you get a park and you get the city all in one. It's got iconic features and structures, including what's known as the cloud there, that silver structure. Everybody calls it the bean. Looks a little bit more like the bean. You walk inside that thing, and because of the reflectance, you can see the whole front of Michigan Avenue. You turn around, you can see the park inside it. It's simply amazing. It's an experience you can get no other place. It's a historical location on Michigan Avenue. It was developed mostly with private funding, mostly by Richard Daley, Mayor Daley, basically turning the screws to corporate interests in Chicago, demanding that they put up money for it. So there's a sponsor name on every location. It's brilliantly programmed, brilliantly planned. Everybody there is smiling all the time. Everybody who has a tourist or a friend come in from out of town goes to visit it. It's simply amazing. It also has added a lot of value to the nearby residential areas. What do these things have in common? All of them have avoided overreaching. They haven't overpromised. They haven't said this is going to change everybody's life forever in the metropolitan area. They've been very specific about what they've tried to do. They've framed favorable images of what success are. This is very important. So people can see success in their heads. They get an image of what a successful program results in. It's not a number, it's not a statistic, but it's how your life changes for the better. They all coupled early success with long-term benefits. They all had clear and transparent goals coupled with adaptable approaches and strategies. They all produced broad and measurable public benefits where you could actually see who was benefiting. They all went beyond local projects, not all of them, but most of them went beyond local projects to try and build permanent capacity. And lastly, they coupled savvy planners who had earned the trust of local leaders, a partnership between local electeds and savvy planners. These are the sorts of things we need to teach more about. So let me turn my attention to Rhode Island and very briefly talk about what I think are the three challenges facing Rhode Island. You may differ. I'd be interested in hearing about that. An aging population and an aging infrastructure base, a state economy not in bad shape, but it's not clear that it's really going anywhere. And finally, a problem that's actually quite common in the United States, which is that a state that consists of an urban area and then a non-urban area, and that the policies and programs that work in one place don't work in the other place. So how do you do that in a state? And a surprising number of states have this problem. So here's some indicators. No surprise, Rhode Island is one of the oldest states in terms of the age distribution in the country. This may not look like a big difference, but the median age as of 2008 in Rhode Island was 38.6 years. For the country as a whole, it's 2 years younger. That's actually quite a big difference when you get to it. Compared to its neighboring states, Rhode Island is right on target. Connecticut's a little older. New York's a little younger. But you can see the percent of people who are over 65 of the cohort is the highest in Rhode Island. I hate to say this because I'm getting at an age where it really hurts to say this, but I see this every day. Sadly, older people don't quite have the entrepreneurial and innovative energy of younger people. I go home at 8 o'clock at night and my students are going out dancing, and part of me wishes I could join them, but I can't. That has less to do with my cultural orientation and more to do with my age. Youth is important. Rhode Island has about 12.5% of its population is foreign born. That's a respectable number, but it's nowhere near New York's number of 21.7%. It has a high percentage of college graduates, not as high as Massachusetts, which is the highest in the country, 37%, but it's pretty well educated. People stick around. Okay, 86% of the population lived in the same house they did last year. Again, that doesn't look like it's a lot higher than the national average of 83%, but it ends up being a big difference. You want people to move. It energizes things. It's not a particularly poor state. The national poverty rate's 13.2%. Rhode Island, 11.6%. New York's much poorer on average. The poverty rate among seniors is not particularly high. However, a lot of the seniors are not working. They're receiving their income from Social Security. Again, it's a conservative state economically and socially. Housing is pretty affordable, both by national and standards and certainly by New York standards. So the population is aging. It's satisfied and not prone to want to change. It likes things the way they are. It may talk about the need for change, but when you actually talk about getting up and moving and changing, it's not the sort of state that's inclined to do that. I'll talk about how to change it a little bit. The infrastructure is not as bad as people think. It's got a bridge problem. 53% of its bridges are structurally deficient compared to the national average of 24.8%. This is their sort of the national measure of infrastructure quality. It doesn't have a lot of big bridges that are falling down, but it has a lot of small bridges that have problems. 11% of its water systems, community water systems, had water quality violations last year, affecting about 8% of the population. That's on the high side nationally. So the infrastructure is getting pretty old. Schools are respectable. Nationally, about national pupil-teacher ratio in public schools about 15.5. Rhode Island, 13.4. We don't need school. We don't need a lot more teachers, and we don't need a lot more classrooms. Well, I shouldn't say we, you. And we, believe it or not, even despite our your historical manufacturing background, there's not a lot of bad stuff generated in Rhode Island that needs to be put into the system. So it's actually the infrastructure system, with the exception of its aging and in some ways its performance, is not so bad. Let me talk a little bit about the state economy. Things are tough right now. 12.7% unemployment rate, not the highest in the nation, only the third highest. Michigan, 14.1%. The lowest is Nebraska at 4.8%, quite a bit higher than your neighboring states. Massachusetts, 9.5%, New York, 8.8%. Rhode Island boomed in the great period between 1998 and 2007. Job growth increased by 10%. That was higher than Massachusetts, higher than Connecticut, higher than New York, only slightly lower than the U.S. average. There were a lot of new businesses started. The number of firms grew by 7%. That's, again, higher than the other states. The share of growth that occurred through small business development, which is where most employment growth happened, 35% in Rhode Island, which was higher, again, than Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. The 10 years prior to 2007 were a pretty good period for Rhode Island. It boomed, and then it fell. It's a classic cyclical economy. It's had 8.5% job loss since 2007, which is, again, is much more than its immediately competing states, and the unemployment rate is quite a bit higher. So there was a boom and there's a bust. This is not an uncommon story. It's the same story for California. It's the same story for Florida. It's the same story for Georgia. The only boom state that has escaped this period, and we can come back and talk about this, that has escaped the bust is Texas. So things aren't looking great, but they're not atypical. It's not particularly worse than other places, although we have to figure out a way to deal with this, or you do have to figure it out. I heard a lot. I don't know how many of you saw the article in The Economist 2 weeks ago on Rhode Island. It was basically an article about the effect of the floods on the state, and then had a lot of scurrilous sort of propaganda about all the things that were going wrong in the state, and basically chalked it up to bad municipal finances and bad government. And so I looked at that article and then looked at a bunch of statistics, and actually, this may surprise you, but your state government and your local governments are not particularly inefficient here. I don't know if they're good or bad. That's for you to figure out. But they're not particularly inefficient. Government employment in the state is about 13.5%. That's on the low side. State and local government employment per 1,000 people, 48 compared to 60 in Massachusetts and 70 in New York. Your budget shortfall here is a little higher as a percent of your state budget in 2009, 13.7%, but that's a function of the business cycle. More importantly, your state budget deficit, I couldn't find numbers on unfunded pension liabilities, but the state budget deficit's only $426 per capita. That may sound like a lot, but it isn't, certainly compared to Connecticut, 1,173, or New York, 921. This is a conservative state, and conservative states don't generally get themselves into fiscal holes. So the story on the fiscal side isn't so bad. The story on the business side, again, it's a story of conservatism. If you look at what CEOs, how they rate Rhode Island compared to other places, in cost of business, it's 46th. So is the rest of New England's pretty high. The cheapest state is South Dakota. In terms of technology and innovation, it's 30th. Massachusetts is 4th. You want to be high. You want to be lower in this case. Higher education is 17th, not bad. New York is first in terms of the quality of higher education. Workforce quality, 18, mid-pack. Massachusetts has the highest workforce quality. And access to capital, here's where it hurts a lot, 39th. Massachusetts next door is number 2. So Massachusetts has a much more dynamic economy. It's taken a while to get there. New York has a much more dynamic economy. Connecticut is virtually a twin. Is it possible to see what Massachusetts is doing and do it a little better? So here's the last set of sort of comparisons I want to make. One state or two. I said it's really 2 states. The first sort of slide there shows where the population's concentrated. Basically, it's in the Providence area, and then it's mostly empty in terms of population density. The next slide on the right shows census tracts that have gained population and lost population. Surprisingly, the population losses are in the southern part of the state and in the Providence area. The population gains are in the rural parts of the area, far away from highways and roads. There's a lot of population growth out there in the outskirts, and that has some challenges. That was between 1990 and 2000. The state has a housing stock. The left shows the age of the housing stock. Has a pretty young housing stock. With the oldest part of the houses, that's the percent of houses built before 1950, concentrated in Providence and the Woonsocket area. If you were to come to Pennsylvania, you'd see it's a much older housing stock, and young housing stocks are much better on average than older housing stocks. Poverty, it's not a poor state. Poverty is concentrated in a few places well known to people here, Providence and Central Falls. But for the most part, you don't see the sort of concentrated urban poverty that you see in many other states. And this last set of slides shows where the jobs are and on the left, and where the job growth has been. The big blue bubbles on the right are where the job growth has been. And the jobs are in Providence. It's a metropolitan-centered economy. And the job growth, the blue bubbles on the right-hand side, are along I-95 over the last 10 years. So, thinking ahead. And when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about the 3 E's: economy, environment, and equity. I have a few ideas. On the economy, you're a metropolitan state. Understand that that's an advantage, not a disadvantage. Think about how you can capitalize on the metropolitanness of the state, and think about how you can expand immigration. Examples of places that you might want to think about learning from are Austin, Indianapolis, and Pittsburgh. On the environment, think green infrastructure and think state conservation frameworks. The major leaders in this area have been California and Maryland. In terms of social justice and equity, think about leveraging opportunity, and 2 of the best, and not just because I happen to work nearby, are San Francisco and Philadelphia. And let me talk a little bit more about each of these. In sustaining the economy, think metropolitan. Metropolitan areas are the drivers of national and regional economic growth and innovation. That's where the future is made. They combine consumer choice. That's where you can get the things that everybody seems to want. They combine everyday amenities. They combine housing choices. Economists talk about something called agglomeration economies. It's efficiency by clustering. They combine entrepreneurship opportunities, and they combine social capital. These things are important. They don't exist, for the most part, outside of metropolitan areas. So capitalizing on the metropolitanness of Rhode Island, particularly Providence, is a real possibility. Think immigration. Immigrants, particularly those that are younger, more educated, and are willing to live and work outside traditional immigrant enclaves, have the entrepreneurial energy to drive metropolitan economies. New York has a very high percentage of foreign-born. They're mostly young. They're reasonably well-educated. They're very energetic. Same with Atlanta, okay? Rhode Island's immigrant population is quite a bit older, not as well-educated, not as energetic. Think about how to attract some of the younger immigrants to the metropolitan areas. That's where they want to be. You can find some states and cities that you wouldn't think have been successful at this. Minneapolis, St. Paul is an example, have been very, why would an immigrant want to go to Minneapolis, St. Paul? They've been very successful at attracting immigrant entrepreneurs. Major examples to look to of metropolitan areas that are similar in size and scope, but not history, to Providence are Austin and Indianapolis, and maybe even Pittsburgh. Austin has a vibrant downtown, has a large graduate university, it has quality residential neighborhoods, it has moderate business costs, not low business costs, but moderate business costs. It's a seat of government, it has very good planning, at least by Texas standards, and it has a very strong civic leadership tradition. Basically, the other fast-growing parts of Texas have succeeded by deregulation and low costs. Austin has succeeded through good planning and good civic participation. Indianapolis, not a place people talk about, but it's really a great model. A vibrant downtown, it's a regional headquarters, much like Providence. It has metropolitan and results-oriented government. It has very, very good city services. It has reasonable business cost. Again, it's not a low-cost city, but it's a reasonable cost city. It's good long-term planning. Again, strong civic tradition. And maybe even Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is nationally recognized for strong civic leadership that's worked with the anchor institutions in that city to ease the transition from a manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. They've done it better than anybody else. The reason I put a question mark there is the city of Pittsburgh is half as big as it was 40 years ago. It's lost half of its population, but it's a much better city. So there are people who wonder how that works, whether it's worth it to lose half your population. Pittsburgh is an interesting place, worth looking at. In terms of the environment, think green infrastructure systems, not just conservation. By green infrastructure, we mean networks of natural systems, co-planned with networks of human systems, a permanent funding base for conservation and green infrastructure planning, conservation hand in hand with planning. The major leaders in this area have been California, which is a leader in land use planning. I mentioned their leadership in coastal planning. I want to talk a little bit about what California's done in 30 years to push the market for energy conservation and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. They have something that's technically called feed-in tariffs, but the basic idea is very similar. If you have solar panels on the top of your house, or you're producing energy from the top of your house, the state or the public or the private utility has to buy it back from you at the prevailing cost. So it makes sense for utilities to actually encourage private generators in place of building new plants. And it's done a tremendous amount to build new capacity, new generating capacity, without building a lot of new plants. There are very strong appliance and building energy conservation standards. There's a 30% renewable portfolio standard requirement. So in 20 years, 30% of California's energy is supposed to come from renewable sources. That's 10% higher than the next highest state, and also has very strong regulations for alternative fuel requirements. California has forced environmental quality and created a market for more environmental quality and more energy conservation. Closer to home, Maryland's been a leader in smart growth by giving state development grants that discourage sprawl and support compact development. And they've also done a lot of work on extensive urban and agricultural runoff standards to protect Chesapeake Bay. If you're thinking about protecting Narragansett Bay, look and see what Maryland's done. And finally, let me talk a little bit about the reason we're here today, equity and Marcia's legacy. Inclusionary zoning. If you're a developer, you hate this idea. Inclusionary zoning says if you're a private developer, then some percentage of your units have to be reserved for moderate and middle income and perhaps low income families. Usually the number is 15 to 20% of your units have to be set aside. The county that's done the best at this, they've been at it for about 25 years, is Montgomery County in Maryland. Depending on how you count it, since late 1970s, they've produced between 2,000 and 3,000 truly affordable housing units, not subsidized, but done by developers. And if you've ever been to Montgomery County, it's not like the developers are hurting there. It's been a tremendous success at producing good quality, affordable housing. A few things that San Francisco's done. San Francisco has its own health care reform legislation, city-sponsored health insurance for uninsured residents, including undocumented residents. So if you need health care within San Francisco, you get a city card. You can go to any hospital in the city, and they will and the city will pay for reasonable health care for you. They've also done something called health impact assessment, looking at how various public efforts will impact people's health. And they've also been a national leader at pulling together all the housing programs to make sure they're delivered in a coherent way for the people who need them most. And finally, Philadelphia, of all places. I didn't know this before I moved there. A few things that have happened in Philadelphia, something 10 years old now called the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, where the city comprehensively assumed ownership of large numbers of tax delinquent and blighted properties. About 20% of the parcels in Philadelphia, the city ultimately came in and assumed ownership on a tax lien basis. A very successful way of building a future land bank, and then but they didn't have a strategy for what they'd do with it. And so that's the then what. It's one thing to actually acquire the land you need for the future build out of your city, but you need a follow-up strategy. Philadelphia did really well on part one, not so well on part two. But something they're doing very well on right now, city judges are intervening in what are foreclosure sales. In Pennsylvania, they're known as sheriff sales, to negotiate a middle ground between lenders and borrowers, forestalling displacement and vacancy. This last quarter, the national mortgage foreclosure rate has been about 3 to 5%. That doesn't sound, it sounds like it's lower than it is, but 3 to 5% mortgage disclosure rate is very high historically. Nationally, I mean, historically, it's usually less than 0.5%. So it's been 3 to 5%. In Philadelphia, which is not a rich city and has a lot of poor homeowners who are underwater, the foreclosure rate is less than 1.5% through this this intervention by justices to protect low and moderate income home ownership. So there's some ideas. I'm sure you're all doing all these things already, and I hope the panel will say, great idea, John, great ideas, or maybe not so great ideas. We're doing them already. I'd love to hear about it so that I can have a 13th success story the next time I give this, and that 13th success story will be Rhode Island. Thank you very much.
John, I want to thank you. I was sitting here thinking, you really did grow up. Always nice. I'd like to introduce the moderator of the panel, the local response panel, who will then introduce the panel members. Mary? Okay. I'd like to introduce Mary Perella, MCP class of 82 probably. She's currently the director of one of the state's only cozies, which is a model full-service public school located in Pawtucket. She is a member of the Bristol Town Council and was a member of the Rhode Island State Senate for 12 years. While at URI in the Urban Field Center, Mary created and implemented the Rhode Island Law Day. So please, Mary, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia, and good evening. And thank you, John, for the terrific presentation that made me ask some very interesting, provocative questions, and maybe I'll have a chance to ask the panel, one of them at least. And I think you hit the nail right on the head in some of those cases. And the one that I want to know is, does Rhode Island want to change? Because that is really the hot number one discussion that's going on in the state at the moment. I'd like to just a quick housekeeping kind of thing. On your chairs, there are index cards, and these are for questions. So if anyone has or would like to ask questions of the panel or of John, please just fill it out and raise your hand, and someone will come through and collect them. And each of the panelists will have about 5 minutes to make a presentation, then hopefully some discussion, and then questions and answers. So I'd like to begin by introducing Kevin Flynn. Kevin, you can come on up. I know you're here somewhere. Kevin received his master's from the University of Rhode Island in Community Planning and Area Development and is currently Associate Director of the Division of Planning for the state of Rhode Island. After serving as Cranston Senior and Principal Planner for 5 years and then its Director of Planning for 20 years, Kevin was selected in July of 2005 by Governor Kucheri to head the planning area, which was elevated to division status in an effort to strengthen its role on issues related to housing, land use, energy, and transportation. Thank you for being here tonight, Kevin. Diane Martins, and in a typical Rhode Island fashion, I was sitting next to her at the reception, and we realized that we have met many years ago and had worked together on a project. Dr. Martins, Associate Professor of Nursing at URI, is engaged in research and scholarly work with vulnerable populations in the community, including a study of the homeless person's health care experiences, analysis of food insufficiency and hunger with homeless families, strategies used to survive in the lives of women facing adversity, and methods to increase nursing students' knowledge and appreciation with older adults in the community. Dr. Martins has co-authored articles on risk and vulnerability and elder abuse. Thank you, Diane, for being here. Steve Pinnell. Steve Pinnell is a member of the URI Providence Campus Marketing Department and serves as coordinator of the Urban Arts and Culture. He completed his studies in educational theater and the arts from New York University and Ohio State University and has served as an arts administrator for over 30 years. The Providence Campus program, which includes both visual and performing arts, is designed to foster interdisciplinary learning and collaboration between URI departments and academic disciplines, and also brings together collaborative partners from the community and the world. Our final panelist is Keith Stokes, and Keith is the new, I think everybody keeps saying new, they'll say that for at least a couple of years, Keith, so this is very new, just a matter of months, is the new Executive Director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation. In that capacity, he is charged with developing short and intermediate term strategies to strengthen Rhode Island's business climate. Keith is known as a seasoned economic development professional who has a reputation for building consensus among stakeholders, forging successful partnerships amongst diverse groups, and turning strategic plans into action. Keith has a diverse professional background, including business, community planning, historic preservation, and government. He was educated at Cornell University and the University of Chicago. And most of you know Keith spent many years working on Aquidneck Island. So those of us from the East Bay are more than delighted at his new appointment and very, very enthusiastic about it. So thank you all for being on the panel. And if you're anything like me, I think you could talk for hours on any one of the points that John raised. So I'm going to ask you to contain yourself to approximately 5 minutes. I'm not really good at watching the watch, but I guess I will try to attempt to do that if it goes too far over. So Kevin, do we want to start with you?
Sure, I'll start. Thank you very much, Mary. Great to see you. Dr. Feld, always a pleasure to see you too. It's been way too long. I was Marcia's graduate assistant for 3 semesters and Howard's for another one, so Howard, great to see you too. Boy, a lot of thought-provoking comments in Professor Landis' presentation. Let me just confirm his assumption that we are 2 states. Maybe more than 2, but at least 2, and it's something that we recognize in the state's land use plan, which establishes something called an urban services boundary. It doesn't have the sort of metropolitan commission force of Portland's, but the historic growth of Rhode Island happened around the bay and around the rivers, and much of the population, as some of your charts indicated, is still centered in the Providence metropolitan area along Narragansett Bay and up the rivers that served as the industrial base of the state's development. And we've been fortunate, despite the amount of sprawl that we've had, that we are still relatively compact in that way. And it's frankly one of the appeals of the state, and one of the things that we try to celebrate in the land use plan and that we're trying to implement is the fact that you have a great, vibrant urban core, cities of Providence and Pawtucket primarily, but also parts of Cranston, East Providence, some smaller urban areas as well. And yet, within a very short distance, a very short drive, 15 minutes at most, you can get out of that urban environment and be out into a very rural country location. and not too many other cities that offer what this area offers. Can you say that? I really think it's one of the great things about Rhode Island. We're trying to advance that through commuter rail initiatives. We have commuter rail to Providence right now. That's being extended to Warwick and to Whitford Junction, hopefully eventually to South County as well. It is the only new transportation project we're doing in the state, despite, you're absolutely right about the infrastructure problems. And by the way, we do have big bridges that have problems. They're located on Route 95, both in Providence and in Pawtucket. In fact, you can't drive a bus over Route 95 in Pawtucket right now. And that's a massive project to fix. We basically have to build a new section of that highway, both near the Foundry and in Pawtucket. Frankly, we don't have the money to pay for it. But we are continuing with the transit initiative. We do have a recently almost completed project, the 195 relocation project, which has the twin benefits of not only working well, traffic, believe it or not, is actually less as a result. The flow is much better, but it opens up huge development possibilities in the property where the highway still stands and will shortly not stand in the Jewelry District, what is called the Knowledge District. So we're not Boston in terms of our metropolitan appeal, but we're also not Hartford or Springfield. And we have a lot going for us, and I think people see that. It'll be very interesting to see the 2010 census results. If you walk around this neighborhood, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen anyone living here other than at the Regency, perhaps. Now there are people who live in Providence. Mr. Cabell is one of them, who lives right down the street. And it'll be very interesting to see the demographics of that population as the 2010 census is revealed. Just a couple other quick points. We are actually right now seeing a slight decrease in our elderly population in the state. It's not surprising given the fact that people in particularly the older elderly years are sort of depression babies where there was a drop in birth rate. That will obviously be going up as people my age enter into their senior years. You talked about school performance. I suppose if you look at just that one issue about the classroom size, it doesn't look so bad, but frankly, I think most people believe that our public schools are not performing as they should be performing, particularly in the urban schools, despite the fact that we invest very heavily in those schools. So I think there's a story in today's paper, I believe, from Rybeck, a bit of a disconnect. We are, I think, a leader in terms of improvements in Narragansett Bay. The largest project, public works project of its type, at least in this area, the combined sewer overflow project, where we have tunneled massive detention ponds under the city of Providence to hold storm and combined sewer runoff in the city of Providence. Obviously not enough to hold the rain that we had a couple weeks ago, but in most storms we'll hold that rain and allow the treatment plant to treat it and meter it out into the bay in a much better way than it has been able to do in the past. An enormous investment by a lot of folks to do that. And just another point I want to make, I could go on and on. One of the things near and dear to my heart is you mentioned about planning and zoning consistency. I think we're one of the states that has the requirement. We do have the requirement. I would say it's a requirement that's honored more in the breach than in actually taking place. It's something we're trying to work on right now. We're introducing legislation to update our comprehensive planning statute, which is 20 years old, has served the state very well, but one of the areas where we frankly do not do a very good job is in the area where communities, for many, many good reasons, often have a hard time implementing the good ideas in their comprehensive plan. And as those of us who have worked in the trenches know, it's one thing to talk about a plan, it's another thing to send out a notice to people telling them that their zoning is going to change. That's when people notice. And many times it's just politically impossible to do. And so in our new version of the document, we're going to be encouraging communities, if you cannot implement your plan, you really need to look at your plan and maybe change your plan and say, great idea, we can't do it, or maybe it's going to take us a little more time to implement it, in which case that's possibly an acceptable response as well. You also talked about historic tax credit. I don't know if any state has had as successful a state program as Rhode Island. Unfortunately, because of its success, it was also very expensive. There's probably no other program in the state that has had the impact on revitalizing urban centers as our historic preservation tax credit. But it was open-ended, and the legislature, given the tough times we've been in the last few years, has reacted to that, and right now that program is in abeyance. Fortunately, most of the projects that were in the queue are still going to be able to be done, but all around us we see the benefits of that program. Hopefully it will come back again. So with that, I should also talk one other sustainable issue. We've done, with very limited funds, we've done a great job in Rhode Island about preserving open space. We actually have more land devoted to farming now than we had 10 years ago. We have a tremendous resurgence in interest in locally grown produce. If you go to the Hope Artist Village on every Saturday morning in the winter, there's a winter farmers market. People are willing to pay more for locally grown stuff. And we're seeing the benefits of that around the state, and it is actually impacting the amount of land in production in Rhode Island. So with that, I'll turn it over to, who would you like next, Mary?
I think Diane. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I was quite impressed with your presentation, Dr. Landis, and I'm very honored to be here at your lecture, Dr. Feld. I am in nursing, and so as I listened to you go through each of the items, I thought to myself, oh, I don't know very much about urban planning, but I know there'll be a point at which I can understand and transfer this into my knowledge base. One strong connection that I have is the relationship between education in terms of equity and education in terms of health. And when I look at each of those, I think in terms of, you mentioned the 3 E's of planning. And when I first heard you talking about the economy, I thought in terms of URI thinking now about developing part of the university in this new knowledge district, which will be in, if the voters approve, in the former jewelry district. And we'll see what happens there. But now I understand a little more about why they want to do it. I did not understand it before I heard you speak today. The second piece is environment, which we know is always important in relationship to health. And children and adults do not learn well unless we're in green environments. And that includes our city schools, our housing projects, that they need to be green environments. But I think the area that I feel is an important one to address is in relationship to equity as it relates to health. And you talked about the health impact assessment at the end of your presentation and about the reasons that some cities have been successful because they have given everyone health insurance, not only the documented, but the undocumented. And I think I appreciated this because you started off your entire presentation, instead of looking at the problems that have existed, like the other authors that you referenced at the beginning, instead you said, well, let's look at what's worked. And in public health, which is in the area I teach, we are not going to be successful as public health workers unless we look at a strengths model. And I think that's what you've done. You've said, let's stop focusing on what doesn't work. Let's focus on what does work. And it brings me to also one of the items that you mentioned, which was in terms of education, that our students do have a higher teacher-student ratio than many other states. You talked about our student-teacher ratio being higher than some of the other New England states. You gave that as one of the health indicators. Oh, I meant lower. Sorry. I'm sorry. I said the opposite. Low is good. And I thought about a report that I mentioned a few weeks ago to some others that came out of Columbia University just last month that talked about the fact that we need to be looking at making other things equitable for our students so that they can succeed. And a student population that's able to learn in these green environments, in neighborhoods where they have, say, that description that you gave of that Chicago playground and that Millennium Playground or Millennium area. I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful if the children from Central Falls could walk out of their school and see that, which is one of our areas that we considered underperforming. And but there were several other items that were mentioned in it, and some of them were things like in being in safe environments, that children that go to school in unsafe, violent environments are not able to succeed in school. That children that cannot breathe in their school buildings because of pollution in the area will not succeed in school. And that was reported in the Bausch report out of TC just last month. And I think that some of the initiatives that you mentioned that have been successful, if we could do that, it may really have a long-term outcome. And you talked about getting to product and outcome as opposed to just process. If we could look at long-term outcomes in terms of how students learn, and maybe some of these developments really could help them to be more successful in school and having healthy environments along the way. But thank you.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if it's appropriate for me to comment or not, but I thank you so much for making those points, because I would love to. That's the kind of work that I do, and it's as a planner, not as a teacher, but I work in education and have worked in education for many, many years. It's always surprising to me that people don't want to see or don't see the link. Like, how can unhealthy children learn? How can we expect them to achieve high standards and the outcomes that by which the schools and they are measured and their teachers if they're living in domestic abuse situations, if they're sick, they have dental problems, if they severe asthma, whatever the cases might be. And that's one of the things that all of us who work in sort of school models are trying to work on, to bring that health, education, social services, social equity together for to support families and kids. So thank you so much for bringing that up. With that, I'd like to ask Steve if he would make his comments.
Certainly. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Diane, I sat thinking, all right, as an artist educator, what do I know about city planning? I grew up in Rhode Island and left for about 15 years, and I came back to Rhode Island almost 20 years ago. And there were so many things that had changed. A river had been moved, and in the course of time, Water Place Park, and there were all kinds of festivals and all kinds of activity. And Providence was identifying itself as an arts location. Sort of, if I looked on the negative side, in the time that I've been here, funding has disappeared. There used to be a number of small theaters in the downtown area. They have disappeared. Funding disappears, funding disappears. There were all kinds of festivals that have disappeared. But I came here to explore social issues through the arts, social justice through the arts, cultures, different cultures. As a matter of fact, the older population of Rhode Island was one of the reasons that I came back here to work with young people and older people. And I think there are a lot of exciting things happening, sometimes in spite of and sometimes around the financial and fiscal challenges. Trinity Repertory Company on the big side, on the more commercial side, even though it's a nonprofit, was heavily in debt more than 20 years ago, and is now, heavily subsidized. But on the small side, the grassroots efforts to work with the homeless, doing arts, to work with the inner city schools, to work with the community-based cultural organizations, to share their cultures, to express their issues, to use arts as a vehicle for self-expression and also communication of needs, health needs. I think there's a lot that's exciting, and the arts really does play an important part, even when sometimes the funding base is removed. Some of the exciting things that have happened in the last few years are that the city, the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Foundation are looking at community-based organizations. They've done several major surveys to explore how arts needs to move out into the community, and and how can it be sustainable in the current economic condition. So there are so many exciting things that are happening here through the arts, and giving individuals an opportunity to learn and to express themselves and their cultures and their needs. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thanks. Keith?
Thank you, Mary. And you know, John, your presentation was compelling for me, for someone who's over the 20-year career has touched various aspects of urban development, historic preservation, and community planning and government systems. And what I'd like to do is to kind of segment, you know, my responses in three critical areas that certainly resounded for me in your presentation. One, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think is an absolute historic preservation initiative and a significant land use planning success story that Kevin touched on, which has been the deliberate restoration and preservation of our historic structures across the state. And this happened across two eras as a success story. The most recent era is the era of the Rhode Island Historic Tax Credit, which, coupled with the federal tax credit, as Kevin had said, literally rescued not only significant urban centers, but significant, for the most part, 19th century and early 20th century structures and mill buildings across the state. It was a significant era and a significant time where we were able to literally meld urban planning, economic development with historic preservation. And certainly one of my charges in working with Ted Stannis, the Historic Preservation Commission, certainly working with Scott Wolf at Grossmont, Rhode Island, we are going to bring that program back. It'll be better managed, it'll be sustainable, but it is an absolute important tool in economic development and community sustainability. The first era that very few people recognize, and who I believe is probably one of the, if not simply my community, Newport's, but possibly the country's first and truest historic preservationists, and really true new urbanists for her time, was the activity of Doris Duke after the World War II in the 1940s and 50s. Doris Duke took it upon herself single-handedly to begin to rescue and restore hundreds of colonial-era tenements. At the time, that's what they were recognized as, is not colonial homes and properties of any historic value. They were simply seen as tenements. And after World War II, and really culminating with work in the 1950s and 60s, coinciding when the peak of our urban renewal era, Doris Duke established Operation Clapboard, and then later the Newport Restoration Foundation, and she literally rescued over 200 colonial-era properties. And she did this very creatively by simply purchasing the properties and then relocating them. So in fact, in Newport, but also as we see in Providence and also in Bristol, our three urban centers, today those three communities comprise one of the largest repositories of pre-Revolutionary War authentic original structures. In fact, my own community of Newport alone, we have nearly 400 authentic pre-colonial era historic structures, which most importantly, unlike a colonial Williamsburg or a Sturbridge Village, which are wonderful restorations, men, women, and families still live, work, and worship in these structures. They are an active, interactive fabric of Newport's urban center, as in Bristol, as in Providence. So those two eras of historic restoration and preservation have an opportunity going forward of establishing a very unique mark in not only sustaining urban living in historic preservation, but also now driving forward a very robust and a very interesting, what we now call cultural and heritage tourism economy. So that's one of the reflections I've certainly seen. I would strongly suggest that one of the great success stories that we've done and we're building upon, need to continue to do, is our melding of historic restoration and urban planning. The second area, which is the whole issue of economic development, it's quite interesting, John, because many of the data that you provided has been a large part of my presentation as we begin to forge ahead in reestablishing an economic development plan and strategy for the state. And one of the most interesting aspects that I have to remind people quite simply is that we're not simply a city-state, but from an economic development and performance basis, we're a city region. And what's absolutely essential to recognize, and John pointed this out quite well with many of his business cost competitive data, being a city region, products, goods, services, customers, visitors, move all within this New England marketplace. They move between borders. We're not California, we're not Texas. People can move with products and goods and services seamlessly within any 6 New England state, reasonably within several hours. You can't get across San Diego in an hour and a half. So one of the things that's certainly an asset that we need to recognize is that as we move forward in developing and designing an economic development plan and strategies, as we begin to develop cost structures to provide a competitive business environment, our competition is not South Dakota. It's not the Midwest, it's not the Southeast, it's not the West Coast. Our competition is creating a competitive, uniform, predictable quality of place and economic performance within the New England marketplace in general, but particularly with Massachusetts and Connecticut. One of the things that I remind public policy persons involved in economic development, particularly here in New England, business people vote with their feet. If you have less than a competitive cost structure, if you don't have access to capital, if you don't have access to a trained and available workforce, you simply move across borders. And what we've seen on a consistent basis, particularly over the last 2 decades in Rhode Island, where our cost structures have gone up and our competitive business structures have gone down, we've seen many businesses that we've seeded and grown here relocate to Massachusetts and Connecticut, and many larger companies expand within those New England states. So it's absolutely essential as we go forward in designing and developing a sustainable economic development plan and strategy, we have to recognize that we need to build a competitive system within the very competitive existing New England marketplace. The third piece I want to talk about very quickly, which is very important to me, is the whole issue of in an urban development plan going forward, we have to also remind ourselves that it's also important to build a case and build a plan to sustain the people and families who live within our urban districts. 12.7% unemployment rate has great attention to the people in this state, but very few people recognize that the nearly 400,000 people who are currently employed in the state, well over 50% of those people employed between the ages of 24 and 65, primary work age, have just a high school education. So when we talk in terms of going forth and growing a knowledge-based economy, which we will, and which we are doing in the transformation of the Jewelry District here in our capital city, we are growing and creating jobs in critical industry, competitive industry sectors that are housed within and co-located within New England and are particularly growing here within our state of Rhode Island. Financial services, information technology, life sciences. Each and every one of those industry sectors demand and require a high-skilled, highly trained, and a highly compensated workforce. A significant number of our urban dwellers do not have the basic skill sets through adequate and supportive public education, workforce training, into the continuum of adult literacy to prepare them to fill those jobs which are being created today and will continue to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. One of the great ironies that I am most concerned about is we will continue to build and we will have a sustainable and successful knowledge district here in our capital city. But a stone's throw away across from the Point Street Bridge, will any of the kids of color and urban dwellers that happen to live in Upper and Lower South Providence, will any of them be prepared to fill those significant job opportunities that we will create in this state? So if we do not align public education, workforce and training, and adult literacy programs, particularly aligned to our urban families and population, we will simply be creating jobs for New England-based and national-based employees. People will choose to relocate to Rhode Island, but the citizens who live here and who particularly live in our urban areas will not have the opportunities to be able to attain these jobs and be able to build a self-sufficient life. So those are the 3 areas: historic preservation, good thing, build upon our economy, understand and recognize and build towards a regional competitive economy, and let's not forget the men, the women, and families that reside in our urban communities. And let's give them the tools to prosper. As we build cities, we build people.
It's terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. And is there anything that you'd like to rebut or to comment on that each other has said? And if not, I'll just throw out one question, and that is, the point that John made that we're sort of a conservative state. and that we seem happy. I think you said, John, that Rhode Island doesn't seem to want to change. You know, we're conservative. We seem to be doing okay. A lot of us would probably refute some of that in terms of the current budget gaps, but it is across the country. And I don't want to put at least the two of you who work for the government, you all work for, the university, but certainly the appointees on the spot. But do you think, given all that we've had, especially with the supplemental budget issues and so forth, that Rhode Island really wants to change significantly the way we do business? Does anybody want to take that, or?
I think I'm a civil service employee, so I may find out differently. I think there is resistance to change, obviously. I think in the past we've had opportunities as a state to do things a little bit more creatively. Let's use the tobacco money as a perfect example of this, where you basically took it all in one shot to plug a budgetary hole. I think that was during the boom years, John, so if that was with the boom years, I don't know. Certainly prior to 2007. There is a tendency, I think, to pull another rabbit out of the hat as opposed to addressing structural deficit issues. One of the notes I'd written earlier didn't get to, we have, I suppose it's a strength, it could be a weakness as well, very strong tradition, as does almost all of New England, of local control. We have 39 cities and towns. We have 39 school systems. We have a little bit of regionalism, not much. We are a state that is, I'm sure, less than the size of the Houston Independent School District, which is one district. If you were to suggest that in Rhode Island, you would have absolute warfare on your hands. And yet we're facing a time of budgetary need where if you can't get something like that moving now, necessity being the mother of invention, when are you ever going to get it moving? And I frankly don't see that happening. I don't see, I see some limited moves toward regional systems, not just school systems, but others, but not a whole lot. And the state is reacting to its loss of revenue, both from sales tax and from payroll tax, reflecting the economy in both ways. The state has less money to share. The cities and towns are taking a hit on that. And I think there are some people, Mayor Cicilline being one of them, who are trying to look at the situation creatively, but I think there'd be great reluctance. Schools are where most of the money is spent toward marrying particularly urban school systems with suburban school systems. I think that is a third rail in Rhode Island, and yet there could be a lot of positive things that could come of it, both from an education and a cost-sharing perspective. But I don't see it happening. Keith, you're the other victim that's at this end.
My sense is we're going to see absolute change very, very soon. Another way of describing a structural deficit is we're broke. Over the next 5 years of revenue forecasting, we're seeing at best a 1.5% to 2% growth in revenue, mostly personal income and sales tax. Our fixed cost in operating this state, without doing anything within the budget, our fixed costs are running at 5.5%. So without any change, we will see close to a $500 million operating deficit as a part of the 4-year 11 budget debate this time next year. The way we deliver government services is unsustainable. As the smallest state, we absolutely should be the beta site for the highest level of efficiencies in collaboration, innovation, and regionalization. The home rule charters of the colonial times are completely inefficient and illogical in applications today. The use of the property tax as an indicator of wealth to underwrite any government services, and certainly public education, is useless, illogical, irrelevant, and ineffective. So I will say to you today that because of the very fact that we are broke, and the very fact that we will now be forced to make very painful but necessary decisions, out of it, we will become a beta site of efficiency and how we deliver government services, be it public education, be it public welfare, be it economic development systems, we will now be forced in a position which we should have done willingly, as the balance of New England states had done through the 80s and 90s. So I think we should all be prepared by the very fact, regardless of who's governor and who the legislative leadership might be, is that we will be prepared to substantially change the way we deliver government services, because there is no funds available on a revenue side in any short period of time to sustain, in no short-term opportunities through tobacco settlement funds and additional federal stimulus monies. We are going to be forced to do what we should have done 20 years before: be innovative, build public services to scale, and collaborate. So my sense is that this is where we need to be, and as planners, this is an opportunity for us to lead and come to the forefront and assist communities and government systems to put forth the best practices in development and design and operation, because my sense is there is no other choices in going forward.
Thank you. I think you're right, there's no magic money this year. There are several questions. In the interest of time, I'll just ask a couple, and there are two directed to you. A couple of them, most of them are directed to you, John. One is, I think, a pretty simple question, is because I think it was at the bottom there. Where did you get your statistical data? And the other, one of them is, did you consider Providence's moving of rivers a national planning success? Do you want to speak from there? Or do you want to...
Well, those are good questions. The data mostly comes from federal sources, and as such, it tends to be drawn from data sources that you can compare from one state to another, or one metropolitan area to another, so it glosses over a lot of the issues that you folks are talking about. But on the other hand, it's not bad. So, for example, statewide pupil teacher ratios are pretty good overall in Rhode Island. That doesn't mean they're good in every district or anything like that. The infrastructure deficit, that's, again, comparing one state to another from the U.S. Department of Transportation's infrastructure survey. So these are the benchmarks that most people use that for state-to-state comparisons, but not for management decisions, which you're talking about, Keith, within local government. I probably should have considered moving a river. I mean, that would probably have been, in the ancient world, one of the wonders of the world, if it were done. So every place I go, people have their own success stories. I think I'll have to look deeper. Moving a river is nice, but you don't just move a river to move a river. The Greek gods did that every day. You move a river to create amenity value, to create a better city, to create development opportunities. And so I think I think you've done some of that here, and I'll have to look and see how much. I just want to come back to Keith. One of the points that you made, and maybe you're going to, or two of the points that you made, because I thought they were very good. You're probably going to disagree with me on both. The first is, I don't know that services are well delivered or badly delivered in Rhode Island. If it's like most states, you can find some examples of all of them. But again, the number that struck me was government workers per population, which is a pretty good overall indicator of efficiency and in terms of service delivery. And Rhode Island's pretty good that way, which means there's certainly room for additional efficiencies, but overall, it's not inefficient. And that suggests that, as you were saying, you're going to have to get doubly creative to find further efficiencies. Now, and I'm not necessarily sure that regionalization is the way to do it. The states that have tried regionalization in one place or another haven't gotten that much more efficient in delivering services. And if you actually look at what Detroit's trying to do right now, which is, I mean, they're really, really in trouble. What they're trying to do as a way of coping with huge budget deficits on the educational side is they're just closing lots of schools where no kids are. There are lots of teachers, but lots of classrooms, but there are no kids going to those schools. So it's not so much a rationalization of services across place as it is finding places where you invest in a lot of capacity, that capacity isn't being used, and finding ways to get creative about that. So let me go to a second point that you made. This is really difficult. The reason I think Pittsburgh is a mixed success story is they've done it with something that sounds like you're doing here. They put together a bunch of anchor institutions. this case, a bunch of universities and hospitals, and they've found a way to reuse the city fabric for the new knowledge-based economy. They've done that very successfully, more successfully than any other city in the country. They're really worth looking at in the way they've assembled land use and anchor institutions in economic development. They haven't created jobs for their low education, low income population. Those jobs have gone to the high level of professionals, some of who've moved in. If you look at what New York has done, New York has some economic problems, but their economic vibrancy comes from young immigrants, mostly. It's really, really, really hard to take the challenge. It's a worthy challenge, and I'm sure you guys are up to it, but it's really hard to do an economic development strategy that converts to a knowledge-based economy and do it in a way that delivers the jobs for your undereducated population. And this is particularly a problem we have I'll tell you, in Philadelphia, 25% of the city of Philadelphia lives below the poverty rate. I think here in Providence, it's probably, what, 10, 11%, something much lower. I mean, we have this problem in spades, and
Providence is much higher.
25% of the population of Providence lives below the poverty level?
I believe so, yeah. The whole state is maybe 11 or 12%, but Providence has got to be a lot higher than that.
Okay. Oh, okay. But anyway, I think I'm glad you mentioned it. It's a huge challenge. I honestly don't know of any city who's been able to meet it. It's a tough one. So good luck on that.
I think that there's a couple of questions that deal with very specific things like the change of the comp plan, Laura. I'll pass that on to Kevin. And I'm sure that the panelists and John will be here for a few minutes afterwards for the couple of questions we didn't get to. So I just want to thank the panelists very, very, very much. Thank you, John. Thank Marcia for the opportunity for this. And I would like to ask John McCrae to come back up. And as he stated early on, Marcia has touched the lives of many, many people, and I'm certainly one of them. I don't think I'd be doing what I do today if it weren't for Marcia. Kevin mentioned that he was. I know Mark, Gayla, Barney, many of the people who are here today. So thank you, Marcia, for everything you've always done for us.
Thank you, Mary. Give her a big hand, please. Now the time has come to show special recognition. I'd like to thank our panel here for this excellent presentation and response to your questions. These are the movers in development in the state, and we're going to give them as much support as we can, and we're really appreciative for them to be here today, tonight actually, to give us some of their wisdom. John, front and center. You can tell I used to be in the Marine Corps. We really appreciate you coming here because, as you know, although we're a very generous campus, we're also very poor. But even in our poverty, we recognize your greatness. And since you are the fourth presentation of the Masha Mocker Feld lecture series, we want to give you this plaque so that you can remember it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And for me, really? We're going to give this to our sweetheart. That's you, Marcia. Marcia retired, but she did not leave us. And for that, we are much grateful. By the way, we will be here again next year for the same thing, and also with a great program. Just a few announcements. First of all, on the 5th, that's 2 days from now. Today is Tuesday, so that's Thursday. We will be here with a program of Women in Business, which also will be a very exciting program. I think we start at 6 o'clock, is that right? 3 o'clock? Okay, I speak at 6 o'clock. So I speak, they throw me out. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock, and that should be an excellent program there. I'd like to also thank some of our staff members. First of all, geez, I keep forgetting. My wife, Peggy. So the way you solve the wife-husband problem is so that the wife will let you back in the house, you bring her to the program with you. See, that's the way I learned that a long time ago. Gayla Gazal, Kat Quinna, who is right here in front of us. I'd like to also thank Rosa Barros, who did a lot of the, she's one of our graduate students who did a lot of the legwork for us here. Zena Fernandez, where's Zena? I heard her. Joanne Tabello, of course, our marketing director. Maria Bajel, who handles our technology things. And then Anna Marie Tush, who's also here. Did I miss anyone? I think I got everyone. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming. With that, the Mass is ended.
Nice to meet you.
Hmm?